I've always been drawn to solitude, to places where the world falls away, leaving only the quiet and the calm. After a particularly stressful month at work, I knew I needed an escape, something that would allow me to disconnect. I had heard about a small lake a few hours north, nestled deep in the forest. The photos showed a pristine lake surrounded by dense woods, with a few scattered cabins dotting the shore. It was perfect. The idea of spending a weekend alone in a secluded cabin by the water seemed like the perfect remedy for the stress that had been eating away at me. The drive up was peaceful. As the city faded into the distance and the trees thickened along the road, I felt the familiar tightness in my chest beginning to loosen. The air was cool and crisp, the kind that smelled of pine and fresh rain. I had rented the cabin through an old website, and the owner had promised that it would be quiet, isolated, and exactly what I needed to reset. He wasn't wrong. The cabin was small but cozy, perched right on the edge of the lake with a short dock extending out into the water. There was no one else around, just the still water and the towering trees that circled the lake like sentinels. I unpacked my bag, a few clothes, some food, and a book I'd been meaning to finish, and settled in. The sun was starting to set, casting an orange glow across the lake, and for the first time in weeks, I felt at ease. The first night was uneventful, just as I had hoped. I made a simple dinner, ate it out on the porch while watching the sun dip below the trees, and then went inside to read by the fire. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of wind through the trees and the distant call of a loon echoing across the lake. It was peaceful. Perfect. I slept deeply that night, waking only once in the early hours to the sound of something tapping lightly on the window. Half asleep, I figured it was just a branch brushing against the glass in the wind. I rolled over and fell back asleep almost immediately, feeling cocooned in the warmth of the blankets and the steady crackle of the dying fire. The next morning, I woke up feeling refreshed, ready to enjoy a quiet day by the water. After breakfast, I decided to take a walk around the lake. There was a trail that circled it, about 5 miles in total, and I figured it would be a good way to stretch my legs and clear my head. The forest was beautiful, the kind of deep, ancient woods that felt like they hadn't changed in centuries. I walked slowly, breathing in the fresh air and listening to the sounds of nature. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of the lake through the trees, its surface smooth and undisturbed. About halfway around the lake, I noticed something strange. There was a small, overgrown path leading off the main trail. It wasn't marked on the map I'd brought, but curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow it for a bit. The path wound deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser and the light dimmer. After a few minutes, I came across an old cabin, much like the one I was staying in, but this one was clearly abandoned. The windows were broken and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Something about the place made me uneasy. It didn't feel like the kind of cabin that had simply been forgotten. It felt like it had been deliberately left to rot. I stepped closer, my curiosity warring with the growing sense of dread in my stomach. As I approached the door, I noticed something hanging from the handle, a small, weathered keychain in the shape of a bird. It looked out of place, too new for the state of the cabin, as if someone had left it there recently. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I decided then that I had seen enough. I turned and hurried back to the main trail, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't quite explain. When I got back to my cabin, the sun was already beginning to set. I tried to shake off the strange feeling from earlier, convincing myself that the abandoned cabin was just an odd relic of the past, nothing more. But as I sat on the porch, watching the sky turn from pink to deep purple, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. The lake, which had seemed so calm and inviting the day before, now felt oppressive, as if the still water was watching me. That night, the tapping at the window came again. I was wide awake this time, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, trying to calm my racing mind. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, but then I heard it more clearly. 3 slow, deliberate taps, as if someone were knocking on the glass. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, straining to listen. The cabin was silent, except for the soft sound of my own breathing. And then, there it was again. Tap, tap, tap. I grabbed my flashlight and swung my legs over the side of the bed. my hands trembling as I clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness as I slowly approached the window, my pulse thudding in my ears. When I reached the window, I took a deep breath and shone the light outside. Nothing, just the empty porch and the still surface of the lake beyond. I let out a shaky sigh of relief, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was a branch after all. I climbed back into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind was too busy replaying the strange events of the day and the unsettling feeling that had settled over me like a dark cloud. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep, my dreams filled with shadows and the sound of tapping. The next day, I woke up feeling drained, my body heavy with fatigue. I decided to spend the day by the lake, trying to recapture the sense of peace that had drawn me there in the first place. I grabbed a book and a blanket and headed down to the dock, determined to relax and forget about the strange happenings. The sun was warm on my skin, and for a while, I managed to lose myself in the pages of the novel, but the unease never fully left me. I kept glancing up from the book, scanning the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching. By late afternoon, the wind picked up, sending ripples across the lake and rustling the leaves in the trees. I decided to head back inside and start dinner, hoping that a warm meal would help settle my nerves. As I stood up, something caught my eye, a small figure floating in the water just off the edge of the dock. At first, I thought it was debris, but as I moved closer, my stomach dropped. It was a small keychain, shaped like a bird, bobbing gently in the water. The same keychain I had seen hanging from the door of the abandoned cabin. I stared at it, my mind racing. How had it gotten here? I hadn't touched it, hadn't even gone near that cabin since yesterday. I backed away from the dock, my heart pounding in my chest, and hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. Something was very wrong. I could feel it in my bones. That night, the tapping came again, louder this time, more insistent. I lay in bed, frozen with fear, listening as it continued. Tap, tap, tap. And then a new sound, footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen, the footsteps stopping just outside my window. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my skin cold with fear. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. And then a soft voice, just outside the window. I see you. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed my bag, not caring about the rest of my things, and ran for the door. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys as I threw the door open and jumped inside. My hands were shaking so badly that it took 3 tries to start the engine. When the car finally roared to life, I slammed it into gear and sped down the dirt road, the trees blurring past in the darkness. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in the safety of the highway, with the lake far behind me. I pulled over at a rest stop, my hands still trembling, and tried to calm down. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that something had followed me. As I sat there trying to catch my breath, I reached into my pocket and felt something cold and smooth. My stomach twisted as I pulled it out. It was the keychain, shaped like a bird. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
I had just moved into a small farmhouse in northern Vermont, far from the city lights and the noise I had grown accustomed to. It was late 2023, and I was feeling the pressure to get away from everything, particularly the mounting tension with my older brother. We'd had enough fights recently that it made sense for me to get some space. When a rental ad popped up online for a quiet farmhouse on the outskirts of a rural town, it seemed like the perfect escape. The previous tenant was moving out under unusual circumstances. He didn't share much, just said he had to go, and the place was mine if I wanted it. Month to month, reasonable rent, it felt like a temporary solution to a problem I didn't know how to fix. The farmhouse was old but cozy. It had a single large bedroom on the upper floor, accessed by a narrow staircase that felt like it could collapse at any moment. The downstairs had a small kitchen, an open living space, and a bathroom. The bedroom door was a heavy, old wooden panel that you had to lift slightly just to close it properly. That quirk didn't bother me. What did bother me was how the house seemed to creak and groan as if it were alive. but I chalked it up to old wood and country living. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile down the dirt road. I never met them. I'd been in the house for almost 2 weeks, and other than hearing an occasional car drive by, the place was dead quiet. Perfect for someone like me who just wanted to be left alone. The isolation was ideal, though it had its eerie moments, especially at night when the only sound was the distant rustling of trees or the occasional coyote howl. One night, after a particularly long shift at the local diner where I worked, I dragged myself home and made a quick dinner. Just scrambled eggs and toast. I was too tired to do much else. After eating, I climbed the narrow staircase, closed the heavy door to the bedroom, and settled in with a book. The wind outside was howling a little louder than usual, and for some reason, I found myself double-checking that the door was fully shut. It just made me feel safer knowing the room was sealed off, even though it didn't lock. A couple of hours later, as I was drifting in and out of sleep, I thought I heard something. It sounded like someone talking. My eyes snapped open, heart racing, and I sat up in bed, straining to listen. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, faint but definitely coming from downstairs. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. No response, just silence. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and turned on the flashlight, shining it towards the door. The farmhouse was dark, and my heartbeat seemed to pound in my ears. After a moment, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. The wind probably carried someone's voice from far off, or maybe I was just hearing things. I tried to go back to sleep, but the unease wouldn't leave me. Minutes later, I heard it again, clearer this time. A man's voice, deep and scratchy, coming from somewhere below. "Who's there?" My stomach dropped. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was in the house. I shot up, grabbed my phone, and quietly moved to the door. As I reached for the handle, I froze, listening. The floorboards downstairs creaked like someone was moving around. With trembling hands, I turned the knob as silently as possible and lifted the door slightly to keep it from squeaking as I opened it. I peered down the staircase, my phone flashlight barely illuminating the dark living room below. Nothing. Just empty darkness. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening for any further sounds. But everything was still. After a few moments of standing there, I slowly closed the door again and locked it with the small latch I had installed earlier that week, just in case. I climbed back into bed, this time keeping my phone in my hand. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still down there, lurking in the shadows. I lay there, trying to convince myself to stay calm, when suddenly, bang! The sound of something heavy slamming against the bedroom door made my blood run cold. It wasn't just a knock, it was a forceful, angry pounding. I could hear heavy footsteps now, right outside the door, and the handle jiggled violently. My heart raced as I pressed myself against the headboard, holding my breath. Whoever was on the other side wasn't trying to be subtle anymore. My phone slipped out of my sweaty hand and fell to the floor, and in my panic, I scrambled to pick it up, keeping my eyes locked on the door. The pounding stopped, but I could still hear heavy breathing from the other side. Then, the voice came again, low and menacing. "Let me in." I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it was closed off. I glanced around the small bedroom, realizing there was nowhere to hide. If the door gave way, I'd be trapped. The latch wouldn't hold forever. In a burst of adrenaline, I grabbed my phone, threw open the window next to the bed, and climbed out onto the small ledge that overlooked the backyard. It was a 6-foot drop to the ground, but I didn't care. I jumped, landing hard on my feet and stumbling forward. Pain shot up my leg, but I didn't stop. I ran, barefoot and terrified, straight to the dirt road, heading for the neighbor's farmhouse down the way. When I got there, I pounded on the door, praying someone would answer. The lights were on, but it took what felt like forever before an older man appeared at the window. He peered out at me with a suspicious look on his face, then cracked the door open just enough to talk. "Help me," I gasped, clutching my side. "There's someone in my house!" He blinked at me slowly, then shook his head. "Ain't nobody been in that house for years." I stared at him, confused. "What do you mean? I've been living there for weeks. Someone just broke in." The man's expression didn't change. "You best leave. Ain't no one lived there since that renter died. Place is haunted, miss." I stood there, stunned, as he slowly closed the door in my face. I backed away from the porch, my mind reeling. Haunted? Dead? None of this made sense. I knew what I'd heard, and I'd definitely seen someone trying to get into my room. I ran back to the farmhouse, my mind spinning. I had to get my things and leave. As I approached the house, I saw movement in the upstairs window, the same bedroom I had just escaped from. My blood froze as I saw the silhouette of a man standing by the window, looking down at me. I turned and sprinted back to my car, locking myself inside and dialing 911 with shaking hands. The operator tried to calm me down as I explained what had happened. They sent a deputy to the house, but by the time he arrived, the figure in the window was gone. The deputy searched the farmhouse, but he didn't find anyone. He assured me it was safe to go back inside, but I couldn't. I grabbed my essentials and left that night, never returning. A few days later, I got a call from the landlord asking if I had any idea why the place was so torn up. I told him what happened, expecting him to ask more questions, but he didn't. In fact, his only response was a simple, "Figures." I moved back in with my brother after that. We never talked about the farmhouse again. I didn't want to know what had really happened there, and I had no interest in ever going back to find out. Story the end?
Story number 3.
It was a dreary Wednesday night, and my mind was still reeling from the exhausting day I'd had at work. Everything seemed to drag on forever, with back-to-back meetings and a string of deadlines that left me frazzled and out of sorts. I had a dull ache pulsing behind my eyes, the kind that felt like it was only getting worse with every passing second. I slumped into my couch after arriving home, but it didn't take long for me to remember that my kitchen was practically bare. The only thing waiting for me in the fridge was a half-eaten container of yogurt and an expired carton of milk. With a sigh, I pulled myself up, grabbed my keys, and decided to make a quick trip to the local grocery store. The place was only a few blocks away, an all-night market that I usually avoided because the fluorescent lighting always made me feel like I was in a hospital. But at this time of night, it was my only option. I arrived at the store a little after 11 p.m., and as expected, the parking lot was nearly deserted. A light drizzle had started, turning the dark asphalt into a mirror, reflecting the dim glow of the store's neon sign. I parked, took a deep breath, and headed inside. The automatic doors slid open with a mechanical hum, and I was immediately hit by the icy blast of the store's overworked air conditioning. The few people who were still milling around were spaced far apart, and the eerie emptiness made the whole place feel sterile. I grabbed a cart and began the familiar routine of wandering through the aisles, my brain on autopilot. I just needed a few things: bread, eggs, and maybe something quick for dinner. As I moved through the aisles, I began to notice how dead the store really was. The usual hum of distant conversations and the clatter of carts was absent, replaced by a low drone of elevator music coming from the overhead speakers. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me, flickering occasionally like something out of a horror movie. I couldn't help but shiver. I was nearing the end of my list when I saw him for the first time. He was standing at the far end of the canned goods aisle, about 15 feet away, and he was staring right at me. His eyes were dark, unblinking, and locked onto mine as though he had been waiting for me. At first, I thought maybe he was just another shopper, but something about his stance, the way he stood so still, gave me pause. He was wearing an old, faded green jacket that looked too big for him, his pants hanging loose around his legs. His hair was greasy, slicked back in a way that seemed deliberate but neglected at the same time. I quickly looked away, pretending I hadn't noticed him, and grabbed a random can of soup from the shelf. My heart had started to beat a little faster, though, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I moved to the next aisle, trying to ignore the unsettling sensation creeping up my spine. But then I saw him again. This time he was at the end of the pasta aisle, standing perfectly still, just watching. His eyes never left mine. The suddenness of seeing him again so quickly sent a chill through me. I pretended to browse the shelves, my fingers trembling slightly as I picked up a box of spaghetti I didn't even need. I moved faster now, my eyes scanning each aisle nervously. I couldn't explain it, but I knew this wasn't a coincidence. He was following me, and he wasn't even trying to hide it. My mind raced through all the stories I had heard of late-night encounters that ended in disaster, of people being stalked or worse. I rounded the corner into the frozen food section, hoping to lose him, but the instant I stepped into the next aisle, I saw him again. He was standing by the freezer doors, not even pretending to look at anything else. His gaze was fixed, sharp, and deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest as I quickly turned back and headed toward the checkout lanes. I didn't care if I had everything I needed. I just wanted to get out of there. The store was mostly empty, save for a young woman at the register who looked half asleep as she leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone. I pushed my cart toward the self-checkout, hoping I could get through without incident, but my hands were shaking now, fumbling with the bags as I scanned my items. I couldn't stop myself from glancing over my shoulder, and there he was, standing near the entrance of the store, just beyond the automatic doors. His expression hadn't changed. He just stared, unblinking, his hands hanging limply at his sides. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. I hurried to finish scanning my items, my breath quickening as I swiped my card and grabbed my bags. The young woman at the register didn't even look up as I rushed past her. The automatic doors slid open, and I stepped out into the damp night air. The parking lot was dimly lit, and the rain had picked up, creating a soft hiss as it fell against the pavement. I could see my car not far away, but I hesitated, my eyes darting around the lot. That's when I saw him again, standing by the edge of the parking lot near the exit. He was just standing there as if waiting for me to make my move. My pulse quickened. I clutched my bags tighter and made a beeline for my car, my footsteps quickening into a near jog. As I approached the car, I fumbled with my keys, my hands slick with rain and trembling with fear. I could feel his eyes on me, boring into my back as I struggled to unlock the door. Finally, the lock clicked open, and I threw the bags inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to catch my breath. I glanced up, and for the first time, he was gone. I scanned the parking lot frantically, but there was no sign of him. Had he given up? Was he gone? I didn't wait to find out. I started the car, the engine roaring to life, and peeled out of the lot as fast as I could. My eyes flicked constantly to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the middle of the road, but the streets were empty. As I drove through the rain-soaked streets, my mind raced. What was that? Who was he? My apartment wasn't far, but every shadow, every streetlight signaled some hidden danger. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, the fear that he might have followed me gnawing at the back of my mind. I finally reached my apartment, the familiar sight of the building offering little comfort. I parked and sprinted to the door, my keys shaking as I unlocked it. I slammed the door behind me, locking it twice for good measure. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. I flicked on every light, my breath still ragged as I tried to calm down. I sat on the couch, the hum of the TV doing little to soothe my nerves. I kept thinking about him, the way he had stared at me, the way he had followed me so deliberately. I couldn't explain it, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. As the minutes ticked by, I started to relax, convincing myself that I had just been paranoid. Maybe he was just some weird guy, someone who liked to make people uncomfortable for kicks. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to the stress of the day. But as I stood to head to bed, I heard it. A soft, deliberate knock at the door. My heart stopped. I froze, my hand hovering over the light switch. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I turned slowly toward the door, my body rigid with fear. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to know who was on the other side. But I already knew. Story the end.